name is Kennedy, and I serve as Associate Chair for Global Programs in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. This series is one of several initiatives that the school has to advance global education and research and also leadership development. This particular series brings distinguished alums to campus every fall and spring to share their experiences, wisdom, and insight with our students and the broader Georgia Tech community. It has been made possible by the generous support of Kenneth Hyatt, who is also a GT alum, as well as the continuous support of MVP, and we wish to express our gratitude to them. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce one of our illustrious alums, who will then introduce our speaker. Rick Zaleski Jr. is a retired professional from Chevron. He retired in 2015, spent over 37 years working in Chevron. He is on several Georgia Tech advisory boards. He is the chair of our school's advisory board, as well as the chair of the Georgia Tech advisory board that serves the president. He is also the chair of the Strategic Energy Institute Advisory Board, and he's on the boards of the College of Engineering and the School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering as well. He has held several positions of increasing responsibility over the more than 35 years he spent at Chevron, 7 finally as Vice President of Biofuels and Hydrogen in Houston in 2003, and then General Manager of Manufacturing and Food Supply Strategy in 2008. He's married to a Georgia Tech ISYE alum, and they have a son who graduated from Georgia Tech in 2013 in mechanical engineering. And he also has a daughter, he and Charlene, he and his wife have a daughter here in her 4th year in ISYE. In his free time, he enjoys fly fishing, woodworking, and an occasional game of golf. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rick Zaleski.
So, one of the things I learned about retirement is I had a new expectation. So this is word to the wise Wick, perhaps. For 37 years, I was not in my wife's life from 8 to 5. And she made it clear to me, the next however long we have on this earth, that's still true. From 8 to 5, I need to find something else to do. So, you all probably have this brochure, and you can see that Wick has had a lot of distinguished accomplishments. I thought I'd tell you some things that aren't written down. So I first met Wick in 1973, when I started here at Georgia Tech, started as a co-op student, and joined the fraternity, Tau Kappa Epsilon, and lo and behold, Wick was there. It turned out that we had a little cadre of, at this time it was Southern Railway, co-op students. I think there was 5 of us, and we're kind of equally split between the mechanical department and maintenance of way structures. And Wick was in the latter. And time goes on, and we kind of graduate and go our separate ways. And in 2008, my son comes to Georgia Tech, and he too is a co-op student. And lo and behold, he winds up being a co-op student for now Norfolk Southern Railway. So these things are kind of, whatever that is, 6 degrees of freedom, you're kind of surprised about that. So I asked Zach, I said, what was it like to work in the organization, the great company called Norfolk Southern Railway, with Wick Moorman being the leader? He said, Dad, there's one thing that's really important to me personally. He said, my safety. I want to come to work, and I want to go home the same way every day for the whole time I'm here. And he said, that's the way Norfolk Southern is led. And that starts at the top and works its way down. But if you don't create that environment for people to be successful, it cannot happen. Towards the end of my career, he gets elected to the board of Chevron Corporation. So we have another connection. So it's just amazing when you're a Georgia Tech person, travel around the world, you'll find somebody that you'll know, and they're a good friend, they're always smart people, and they care about what they do. So with no further ado, I'd like you to welcome Moorman.
Thank you, Rick. Yeah, there are a lot of memories. I have a couple around Rick in particular. He and Zach, his son, had red hair, red hair. And of course, at Georgia Tech, it was a bouffant hairdo. And we called you Zaz. Zaz. And I always remember there was some kid came into this apartment we were living in, and he was looking for Rick, and he said, is Zig here? And we said, Zig? He said, no, I mean Zag. And I thought, okay. But we do go back a long way. And Rick, as you heard, had a great career at Chevron, which is an absolutely outstanding company as well. So thanks very much for the introduction. And good afternoon to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Tech and see the campus. Got a little bit lost on the campus today. It's amazing what they've done. And see some old friends as well as hopefully make some new ones. I will tell you the audience is a little bit loaded today. There are a number of NS folks in here, including representatives of the Norfolk Southern Information Technology Department, which I had the great pleasure to work in for a good long while. Tech is a special place. I made friends here that I have still today. And I received a real education here about engineering and about life, and I'll talk about that and its importance in my career in a little bit. So Reggie sent me the invitation to give this lecture, and my obvious and immediate inclination was to say yes, as I'm retired now, right? I don't get out that much anymore. I'm on a fixed income. My wife said it a different way. It says a different way. She always says, I married you for better or worse, but not for lunch. And most importantly, my ability to have audiences in front of me so that I can discourse intelligently and impart a lot of wisdom to people that at least have to feign some level of interest has really evaporated since I retired. So it's gotten to the point where really we have a little 8-pound Bichon Frise named Lucy, and I talk to her a lot, and she doesn't really seem that interested either. So it was a lot of fun to say yes, and then immediately it hit me who the two prior speakers had been, right? Dr. Clough talking about climate change, and then Phil Breedlove, General Breedlove, who is the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And I don't know about all of you, but I mean, isn't the title Supreme Commander? Isn't that what we all want someday, right? You know, part of the culture of Norfolk Southern, which I'll also talk a little bit about too, which we've done a lot of work on, was it's a very hierarchical culture, particularly in the operating department where I grew up. And everyone calls their superior Mr., right? Even if Mr. So-and-so is 30 years younger, it's Mr. So-and-so. And as part of trying to change at least some of that, everyone I met, I always said, call me Wick. And there were some number of people that would say, I just can't do that. I haven't been trained to do that. And I always said, well then, in that event, a simple Your Excellency will suffice. And that usually brought them back to calling me Wick. But anyway, so here are these people with, I mean, are truly eminent, talking about really serious things. And I figured maybe I'm the light entertainment or something like that. But I decided to do it anyway. And then I said, well, Reggie, what should I talk about? And he said something pretty vague, like, well, people are always interested in hearing about your career and what you've learned and things like that. And so fortunately for me, if not for all of you, this really kind of leads into really me talking, which I will today, about two of my three favorite subjects, the railroad and me, okay? My top favorite is my family. I will be available for pictures of my grandchildren a little later, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the railroad and what it is, what it does, and then my career and maybe some of the things I've learned about it, and then we'll take some questions. So that's a long preamble. let me get started and talk for a little bit about the railroad business. So, some years ago, I had to give a talk to the high school class at the school where my children both went to high school. And this could be an intimidating audience. That is a supremely intimidating audience, right? These are 10th through 12th graders, right? Sitting in this big auditorium. Lord only knows what they're thinking, right? It may have something to do with hormones. It could have something to do with anything. But they're not really looking forward to seeing an old guy get up and talk about what on earth a railroad is. So I kind of went over and over and over, and I came up with with at least an idea of how to describe our business in very simple terms. And I got so enamored of this idea that I've used it frequently since then for audiences like you who I want to say right up front are far more sophisticated than a bunch of 10th to 12th graders. But it's always kind of made sense to me, so see if it makes sense to you. The way I describe the railroad business and in general is by using, have you heard this? Any of y'all heard this? Okay, is what I call the 3 F's. Now, I'm cheating because one is just a phonetic F. So what are the 3 F's? They are physics, franchise, and finance. And if you understand those 3 elements of our business, you kind of get an idea of what we're really all about as a going concern. So let me talk about physics first. It turns out that the area of contact of a steel wheel on a steel rail is about 2.5 square centimeters. And using the skills which I learned at Georgia Tech and the fact that a rail car typically has 8 wheels, that means it's about 20 square centimeters per rail car of steel on steel contact. Right? With me so far? This is kind of why I skipped ME. So a 100-car train is about 2,000 square centimeters of contact area. That's about half a meter by half a meter in area. So we can haul 100, I just lost my train of thought. We can haul 100 cars of each with 120 tons of coal or grain or whatever it is you want in that surface area. And it turns out, and I actually looked this up for this distinguished audience, that if you look at the rolling coefficient of friction for steel on steel, it's about 0.001 to 0.002. Let's compare that to a tire on asphalt, which is about 0.006 to 0.01. And it's that essential efficiency of moving goods, of moving freight, that brought the railroads into existence, and it's the reason why 180 to 90 years later, we are still a vibrant part of this economy. No one has yet figured out a better, more efficient way to move lots of freight than the railroad business. And quite frankly, until teleportation comes along, which will, I think, be invented here at Georgia Tech, no one's going to figure it out. So not only does this tell you why we've survived and endured, but why we prospered and why we'll continue to prosper. Okay? Physics. That's why we're not buggy whip manufacturers. Franchise. We are franchise businesses. There are 7 fairly big railroads in North America, right? 2 big ones in the West, 2 somewhat smaller in the East, including Norfolk Southern, 1 more in the US, and then 2 that are essentially Canadian. All of us are franchises, and what we do and what we haul and how well we do depends on where our routes are and what customers we serve. Because you don't go out and build new railroads a lot. M&A is not really part of our business. So if Norfolk Southern, for example, serves the biggest Toyota plant, the first Toyota assembly plant in the United States, which it does, which is up in Georgetown, Kentucky. That's part of our franchise, and that's an important part of our ability to make money. The stronger your franchise, and franchises are driven by things like industrial development. We are all actively out there seeking to bring new business online. And it's to some extent driven by the wisdom or lack of wisdom by the people who built our lines 100 years ago in terms of their grades and curvature and their operating efficiency. But we're all franchises, and we have to live with the franchise that we have. So at NS, for example, we spent a lot of time and a lot of money, and fortunately some amount of public money, really enhancing our franchise for our line that runs from essentially Memphis and New Orleans up to the Northeast, so we could haul more containers and take more trucks off the highway. So franchise, make sense so far? The last is finance. We are really, really capital intensive businesses, right? We have a lot of infrastructure, a lot of assets, and we spend a lot of money every year, all of us, maintaining them and improving them. So 17, 18, 19% of sales goes right back into the company in capital. I'll give you, for example, an example. We, NS, are an $11 billion plus or minus revenue company. Last year, we put almost $1 billion. Our total CapEx was in excess of $2 billion. We put almost $1 billion just back into rail, cross ties, and ballast to maintain the property, and then spent almost another $1 billion in expense dollars as well. So railroads eat cash. We need a lot of money. What's the implication of that for our business? We need high gross margins. In general, we like to see a 30% gross margin, which translates into what the railroads use as their primary indicator of efficiency, a 70 operating ratio, okay? We're the exact opposite of a grocery store. If you want to open a grocery store, big grocery store, right? You go build a concrete block building, you put in fluorescent lights, you spend you spend some money on freezers and cash registers, and then you put a lot of groceries in there, and your goal is to sell a whole lot of cans of soup and make a penny on every can. Because your next capital expenditure is when the freezers wear out in 5 years. Or a cash register. Somebody spills a Coke in a cash register, whatever. So it's put a lot of stuff in it and spin it and make very low margins, but because you don't need much capital, it's a good business, an adequate return. We have to make high returns. We have to charge the rates in order to do that. And our asset turns are less, if you look at the book value of our company, it's higher than our revenue. Our asset turns per year are less than 1. So it's fine, it works. We're allowed to make it work these days because of regulation, but it's a very different business model than a lot of other companies. Really, the closest thing probably to us is a utility. And we are often thought of as utilities. The problem is, of course, utilities are real monopolies, and our business can go away. So that's it. You guys are now experts in railroads. Okay, there will be a quiz. One other way to think about us, which I think is always interesting too, is, and this is not an original thought to me, is that we are the kind of the 19th century version, if you will, of the internet. We are a common infrastructure and a common set of operating protocols upon which we move a lot of different businesses with a lot of different business requirements. UPS is a huge customer of ours, right? So are people that haul sand and gravel. And those businesses are radically different. And the way you make money in the railroad business is you maximize the use of that common infrastructure and those common assets to handle all of those different businesses successfully, giving each one the service it needs. Okay, you're now real experts in the railroad business. So let me give you some fun facts about our business and then talk for a minute about how it's doing. As I said, there are 7 large railroads in the country. in North America. There are really essentially 5 in the United States, 4 big ones and a smaller one. There are a lot of little short lines around. Short lines which basically are running spin-offs from the big companies. Little lines where there's just not enough business to justify Norfolk Southern staying in it, but a local person who can go talk to that industry every day and who has ties to the state legislature, so they'll give him a little money for maintenance, and he can buy worn out locomotives and he can buy 5 of them, and if only one runs, he's got a good day. You know, there are those kinds of carriers, but they're the big carriers. There are about 160,000 route miles of railroad in the United States, about plus or minus 250,000 employees, down from over 1 million when I started in the business. We're very heavily organized. About 85% of the people who work for Norfolk Southern belong to a union. We deal with 13 unions. So, and we are governed by something called the Railway Labor Act, which predates the National Labor Relations Act. Interestingly enough, the only other industry that's governed by the Railway Labor Act are the airlines. And the Railway Labor Act is designed to make work stoppages almost impossible for reasons that I'll talk about. We're very heavily regulated. That's really, to some extent, a legacy of the time prior to World War II, when we were a true monopoly, or at least much closer to a true monopoly. And that regulation, while it's been moderated, still exists. We're under something called the Surface Transportation Board, which regulates primarily our rates and issues to do with service, things like that. We're regulated by the Federal Railway Administration, which has primarily a safety outlook and then operating protocols and things like that. We fall under the regulation occasionally of something called PHMSA. How many of you have heard of PHMSA? No, I hadn't either. The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and that became a big deal when we started hauling crude oil, because they end up having jurisdiction over that. We're under DOJ for various things, and then we're constantly working with the legislature of every state. Norfolk Southern is 22. All the railroads work with state legislatures as well. We have a lot of issues and relationships all over Capitol Hill. A part of my job was to trek up to Washington probably monthly and wander the halls of Washington. That's an interesting experience. I'll say it like that. You can walk away and say, I don't know what our world is coming to, but you still got to do it. We haul a lot of stuff. We produce about 40% of the gross ton miles of transportation, freight transportation in this country. That's a misleading figure because we haul everything that people ship in bulk that's heavy. Our actual loads are a significantly smaller part of that, but I'll give you some examples. If you bought anything recently in a big box store that was made in Asia, the odds are very good it got here in a container on a train. If you've been in an automobile today, there's a 70% chance that automobile moved from either a port or an assembly plant to the local distributorship. And while this may not be politically correct in some circles, even with the recent changes in the energy markets, if you have, for whatever reason, flipped a switch on a wall today and the lights came on, the odds are really good that at least some of those electrons came to you courtesy of Plant Shearer down above Macon, which burns coal from Wyoming that Norfolk Southern brings in from Memphis. So if the railroad shuts down within 3 days, there are significant parts of the economy that shut down. Not known widely, right? You kind of think of us as the people who block crossings. We're invisible, which is a real problem for us to a large part of the community. Yeah, we're the people who make noise, block crossings, do all of this stuff. And because 40 years ago, or more importantly, 60 years ago, there was a really good chance that an audience sitting here 60 years ago, I could have gone around it, and almost everyone would have had someone in their family they were aware of who worked for a railroad at one time. Those days are gone. We don't employ that many people. the days when we had an agent in every town that we served who got out and did public stuff as well as handled business. Those days are gone. We're largely invisible, although I will say one of the most interesting things that's happened in my time at CEO in the last 10 years, all of a sudden we've gotten a little more visible. And our importance, particularly with public policy leaders and community leaders, we've become much more desirable in some way because it's seen that we really foster economic activity. If we put an intermodal facility in somewhere, businesses start to grow all around it, just de facto. So that's a positive sign, but we're still largely unknown. So how are we doing these days? The answer is, fortunately, pretty well. The railroad business went through a very significant decline post-World War II. Really, the construction of the interstate highway system and the serious advent of commercial aviation just took away a lot of the business that we normally handled. And the economics of most of the industry suffered precipitously. I'm happy to say that the Southern Railway, the company I went to work for, and then Norfolk Southern, which the Southern became part of after the merger, were exceptions to that rule. We did well. But the other thing that happened was the infrastructure of the American railroads just really went into decline, to the point where in the Northeast, some of you may remember the Penn Central, which at its time was the largest bankruptcy in the history of the United States. They tracked something called standing derailments. So you got a boxcar, it's there on the track, and the next minute, it's not, because the track is bad enough that it's just collapsed under it. There was real discussion in the 70s about nationalizing the railroad business. It was a serious conversation that went on. And finally, confronted with a crisis, the Congress acted 10 years later, but in 1980, they partially deregulated our business in something called the Staggers Act, which replaced the old Interstate Commerce Act. It liberalized our ability to market. We actually could sign a contract with a customer, which we had not been allowed to do before. Crazy stuff like that. It allowed us to downsize more effectively and allowed us to merge more effectively. And that was really important because there were a lot of surplus assets out there and there were a lot of railroad companies. It took us a while to sort through all of that, but by 2000, following the three big mergers, the UPSP, the Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe, the BNSF, which is now owned by Warren Buffett, and then Conrail, NS and CSX splitting up Conrail, we kind of had a stable industry structure. And once the recession in 2001 and 2 ended, the railroads really went through a real renaissance. We kind of right-sized and the business started to grow. And it was really good. And it's been, with a few exceptions, pretty good ever since. And there's a really good news story here. And it's a good news story not just for the railroads and their shareholders, and people like that, and their employees, but for our customers, right? For the communities we serve, and really for the public in general. Because what's happened is the railroads have grown more profitable. We've taken most all of that money, all of us, and put it back in the property. And improved our infrastructure, improved our assets, improved our ability to deliver service, and with it, take more trucks off the highway and do all of the things that are just generally good in about every sense you can think of, unless you're a trucker, but that's not true because a lot of trucking companies now team up with us and use us for the long haul, and they do the short delivery. So one thing I will tell you, and you read a lot of stuff, to the contrary, the freight railroad, and by the way, I'm talking about freight railroads in the United States here. I'm not talking about Amtrak or any of that stuff. I'd be happy to talk about it in Q&A, but not here. The railroad infrastructure today is in probably the best condition that it's been since World War II or before. It is by and large in superb condition. People tend to think that it's probably not, because a lot of people judge a railroad by a bridge over a highway. And let me just be frank. We don't paint bridges unless we have to. But the track on top of it's really good. And the service we offer as a result is really good. Now, this is a contrast to the highway system, right? The highway system in this country, remember the interstate highway system was built in the 60s? And a lot of things that were built had a theoretical 50-year life. 60 plus 50, right? We're about due. In some places, we're overdue. And the fact of the matter is, there is not the money, and even if there was money, there's not the political will to spend it. I'm afraid to even fix what we have, let alone add the capacity that we need if the U.S. economy is going to grow. But the good news for everybody is that the railroads are investing. We are growing capacity. We're doing it with private dollars, not taxpayer dollars. And we understand the challenges as an industry and are prepared to do our share and hopefully take more and more business as a result. Sound like a plan? Everybody good with that? Good, that's all you need to know about railroads. So that's enough about trains. Let me talk about something a little more exciting, me. I'm going to give you my life history very quickly, which includes a lot of lessons learned. So I was telling someone earlier, I grew up in a little town, Mississippi, called Hattiesburg. My father was an English professor and then later a dean at Southern Miss. And my mother actually taught Latin and Greek at Southern Miss for a while. And that is really a weird genetic pairing to produce an engineer, right? I mean, that's just kind of strange. My brother's a doctor, you can kind of see that. But the most important thing to know about my childhood is I was a kid who loved trains. Now, there are kids who love trains, right? I have a 3-year-old granddaughter who really likes trains. I am trying so hard to foster that. But I was one of the kids who didn't grow out of it. And that's unusual, but it's turned out to be a great blessing for me. And the theme I would give you about my career and my life in general is that you will never see or meet anyone more fortunate than I am. I have been blessed in every way that I can think of. Family, education, career. I'm just in the random walk through life, and things always can change, and I'm very aware of that. Let me put it, in the random slot machine of life. What is it, 5 cherries or 3 cherries or whatever? So far, it's been really good. And a big part of that good fortune was finding my way up here to Georgia Tech. And it wasn't quite random. I thought I would be an engineer. I was good at math and science. That's about all I knew about engineering. I liked the idea of Atlanta, a big city. So I came up here. I was telling someone earlier, the first time I ever saw Georgia Tech was when I got my keys for my dorm room in the summer of 1970. And I signed on also to be a co-op student. I didn't know any more about being a co-op student than I did an engineer. But in another stroke of great good fortune, and there's a story involved with this that just illustrates that good fortune, I signed on as a co-op with Southern Railway. It's kind of about as good as it gets, right? Was for me. And at the same time, as part of the deal, I changed my major from mechanical engineering to civil engineering. And it was only after a while that I realized that this was yet one more blessing, because I really liked the civil engineering curriculum. And I only had to take 1/4 of thermodynamics versus 3, right? Which was probably the most unintelligible course I took my entire time here. So I loved civil engineering, and I got a great start in my career. So that alone, I owe an enormous debt to Tech for. But it did some other things for me as well. It gave me a lifelong disdain for the University of Georgia, which has served me well. But what it really did, and this is to some extent a cliche, and the problem with giving talks about anything is when you start to talk about the eternal truths, they're all cliches, right? They're the the markers of life and, the fundamental things, which are absolutely true, always, because they're said so often, sound like almost trite, and they're not. What Georgia Tech did is it taught me how to think, right? To think analytically, to ask questions, to find data, and to try and make judgments based on data rather than purely emotion. You always have emotion when you make decisions. That's part of the deal. But the more facts and the more data you can gather, the better your decision is going to be. There was a great quote by George Orwell, which I had on a postcard and kept on my desk for many years. And he said, it requires an enormous amount of effort to see what is in front of one's nose. And Georgia Tech, I think more than any other place, taught me how to try, at least, to always look in front of my nose and see what was going on. So it's a wonderful institution, and one of the great strokes of good fortune in my life, as I said, was to come here, not really knowing necessarily what I was doing. So I got out of Tech in '75. I was hired by the Southern Railway in their management trainee department. I am one of those slackers who never did a day's worth of engineering after they graduated, right? Actually, I drew some drawings, I think, or something like that. But I went out to work in the management training program at Tech, and at Southern Railway. Here in Atlanta, I worked for a guy who held a position of division engineer, and this gentleman who just passed away, was really somebody who I thought the world of, believed that the best way to learn how to work for the railroad, and management trainees went to work in the track department, right, maintaining track, right? The best way to do that was to go out and work on a track gang in the heat of the Georgia sun. And that's what I did for the first 6 months. I figured out how I could drive railroad spikes with railroad spike mauls, and the GE hammer. I could pick that baby up and probably hit a spike with it. Might still be able to, But I figured out actually that once I got out and did that, I kind of liked it. I've always enjoyed physical work, and all through my career in the track department, which lasted 12 years, I always liked to do a little bit of work along the way. I learned a lot in that. I learned the value of hard work. And in the railroad business, out in the operating department, you got to work hard. You're on call all the time. You're expected to be there come rain or shine, regardless of the day of the week. For a long, long time in our company, and I look back at it now, I spent 12 years being at a telephone somewhere on my region at 7 in the morning every morning, even if it was a 3-hour drive from home. So I learned all of that. I became a pretty good track guy. And that leads me to kind of a lesson that for people that I think is really important. If you're going to advance in your career or whatever it is, the first thing you got to do is be pretty good at something, right? No one has ever said, old so-and-so is really not working out over there. Let's give him a bigger job over here. You've got to kind of have that as a baseline for everything you do. If you're not competent, highly competent, the odds are you're not going to be given the opportunities that you would otherwise. So, along the way, I acquired some really not so good management traits in our company. I absorbed some of that culture. Remember that? Yes, sir. Although even then, I didn't buy into the Mr. thing quite that much. And by the way, corporate culture is an interesting thing, right? Somebody told me once, I was saying, I don't really know what our culture is. And they said, that's fine. We have an old saying, it's not a fish who figured out there was water. You just go in and you just start to breathe, and then, it's only when you talk to other people and they say, really, y'all don't do that, that you figure out what your culture is. But my undesirable traits were I really became, and this was kind of bred into you at the time, an really adept micromanager. Man, I had my thumb on everything and everybody. That's not good. That's not good. Even if people thought it was good, it was not really good. And the second was I had a very narrow, if deep, view of the railroad. I knew all about railroad track and a lot about railroad operations, and I didn't know anything about physics, franchise, or finance, right? So I had this kind of view of the world. At the end of 12 years, I had an early midlife crisis, which I told people at the time I was having an early midlife crisis. My wife, who probably the greatest blessing in my life, told me at the time, she said, it's okay to have an early midlife crisis, but remember, you only get one. And so far, I've lived up to that. So I had the great good fortune, again, same thing, to be accepted at Harvard to the business school. We loaded up our 2 children. We moved to Cambridge, Mass., and I had 2 great years. I loved it up there. My wife, who is from North Carolina, where people are polite and considerate and chat with each other in the grocery store line, woo, they're not like that up there. They're Yankees. Let's just say it right now. You know, they're wonderful people if you get to know them. But if you look at someone and say, hey, in the grocery store line, you know, you're taking your life in your hands. I learned 3 lessons up there that are tremendously important. The first, interestingly enough, was the importance of diversity, which I'd never worked in a diverse environment. I'd never really thought about it. And it was just so eye-opening for me to see this extraordinarily diverse group of bright people and how everyone thought and how powerful that concept was. And that's something that I brought back to NS, and hopefully over the past number of years, ladies, you're looking at me skeptically, it's something that we've really tried to focus on. Because without diversity, you cannot be as good as you can be. And our company has moved a long way that way, and that's something I'm really happy about and very proud about. The second thing I learned was what I'd call the interconnectedness of business, right? Marketing is connected to operations, is connected to finance, is connected to whatever, government relations. And if you push here, you better be aware of what's going on here. You know, businesses are webs, not just silos. And if you don't figure that out and make sure that you strengthen those webs and understand them, you're going to run into a lot of problems. You have to see the big picture, something I had no idea. And the last thing, which I always say only half facetiously, is I learned the limitations and frailties of corporate management, right? When you're kind of a mid-level manager down there working on the track in Greensboro, North Carolina, you're really not aware of what's happening at corporate, but you think, boy, those people are vice presidents, executive vice presidents. They got to be really smart and really good. Well, the Harvard Business School curriculum is 2 years of cases designed essentially to refute that point, right? It's company after company where somebody's done something really stupid, right? I'm exaggerating, but not completely. And I've always been much more guarded in assuming that anybody at any particular level in a company is really competent since then. And it's, every once in a while, it serves me well. Back to the good luck theme, I left the company, a long story, I left Norfolk Southern, and then they hired me back. And it wasn't quite clear that was going to happen. And I went back to a staff position here in Atlanta, and I was instantly over my head because I went into an area where I really did not know anything other than the top level. And it was a real shock to the system. And 2 great lessons came out of it. First and foremost, you can't micromanage people if you don't know what it is that they're supposed to do. So that instantly took me out of that. And then I found it was so much more fun anyway to manage at 30,000 feet. And since then, people have been trying to tug me down rather than get me out of their hair. But I was totally reliant on advice and expertise of people that work for me. So I couldn't micromanage. And the second was I needed to figure out really quickly who was good and who I could trust and who wasn't. And that's a really important characteristic. I had a lot of very talented and conscientious people around me, but I had to sort through the people in a way that I'd really not had to sort through. And then the last thing is I had a wonderful boss. And he showed me something I'd not really seen in quite the same way before, the power of mentorship. what a good mentor can do for someone. So, after that, I was elevated for reasons that still elude me to some extent to a number of increasingly important positions about which I knew less and less. I became Vice President, Personnel and Labor Relations. They called me up, told me they had the job, the chairman of the company did. I asked him 3 times if he was kidding. I didn't know a damn thing, if you'll excuse me, about personnel and labor relations. And then after a year and a half, we ran a buyout and the head of IT left. And my boss said, I think I want you to go run IT. Here's my sum total knowledge of information technology. Control, Alt, Delete, right? And I met a lot of wonderful people here, and we limped through, didn't we? We kind of made it, yeah. Not really because I was any good as head of IT, but because I had great people in information technology who helped me enormously. I went off and ran a little telecom venture. That was exciting. Taught me the meaning of failure when the telecom world collapsed. And then became president and chief executive officer, to my surprise and the surprise of a lot of people. The newspaper in Norfolk, which I now won't read, I canceled the subscription, but they wanted to do a profile of me because I'd become president, and that was the indication I would become chief executive officer. And so they talked to all kinds of people. They talked to my brother and my mother and all these people at NS. And they were going to do this article in the Sunday paper, right? In the business section, okay. And I knew the Sunday it was coming out. So I get up, we had 2 dogs at the time, and I get up and say, I'm going to walk the dogs. My wife says, fine. I'll go out, walk them. She, in the meantime, gets up, gets the paper, and gets the business section out, right? Takes a look at it. And so I walk back in, and there it is. And they have this full-page picture of me at the top. And I'm a little sensitive about my neck. And I'm kind of leaning back with 7 or 8 chins, right? Laughing. And literally, all it lacked was someone photoshopping the hand with the big cigar in, right? Here, Daddy Warbucks is at it again. And the first paragraph says, and I am not paraphrasing much, it essentially says, you would think that any company who has a clown who's lost tens of millions of dollars in telecom would kick them out on their ear. But Norfolk Southern has a different idea. Wick Moorman's going to be CEO. And I read that paragraph and I saw that picture and I put it down. I couldn't read anymore. And it turned out, right, that was their leader, and it was a really nice article and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, I overcame telecom and became CEO, and we had a great ride. I had a great ride. I had a great team, and it's a great company. So I'm going to finish up by kind of summing up some other things that I learned. The first thing that you have to, and these are kind of the CEO things, maybe. You have to have humility, right? I was saying to someone earlier, if you meet anyone who has been fortunate enough to become chief executive officer of a fairly big public company, and at some point, you may have to ask them, but at some point they don't just tell you, well, a lot of it was luck, then they're not telling you the truth. And actually, most of the CEOs I know, and I know a number of them, would tell you exactly that. It's not that you don't work hard. It's not that you don't try to do the right things. It's not all of that. John would tell you that, right? It's right. You also got to be the right age, in the right time, right place, all of that. And I just happen to have that. And there are a lot of other, not everyone that works for, not every, well, I wouldn't give you a percentage of the 30,000 people who work for NS that could be CEO, but more than one, right? More than just me. And you just got to remember that, and you've got to trust people, and you've got to listen to them, and then you've got to get out of their way. Because the other thing CEOs will, with any veracity, will tell you is they don't run the company. I didn't run the company, right? I wasn't making the big day-to-day decisions. I have a good friend who ran a big drug company. He said, now you know your job is to make 8 or 10 decisions a year. Now, the problem is baseball Hall of Fame averages don't cut it on those 8 of 10. you better get most of them right. You don't necessarily bat 100, but you get most of them right. Second thing, we tried to manage by consensus, always. I had a great team. I keep saying that, it's true. And we'd have a lot of debate, a lot of things, and then if it was really in doubt, I'd have a vote. And every once in a while, and I'd vote. And my vote counted as much as all of their votes and one more. But it was very rare that that ever happened. You don't manage people that way. Every once in a while you have to kind of do that. But if you do it a lot, people will stop listening, they'll stop talking to you, and they will wait for you to make the decisions, and that's a really bad place to be. You got to have some kind of vision. That's another thing to say. It's kind of trite, but it's so true. There's a saying I love. You can tell I like a lot of sayings. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. That's a bad idea, right? You've got to at least have an idea of where you want the company to go. Not tomorrow, although in a technology company it may be tomorrow, but in a company like theirs over the years. And then once you choose a path, and unless something radical changes, you don't waver, right? You try and set direction. You try so hard not to give orders. It's a bad idea. You think about offense as well as defense. Always. You're always open to bad news. You don't ever shoot a messenger. You honor the messengers if you can. And you tell people, and you mean it, if there's something going on and it's not good, come tell me. I'm not going to, I never killed anybody. I guess I'm a bad candidate for president of the United States. You lead by example. This was really borne home to me after I got the job. Everybody watches you. Everybody, right? What are you doing? What are you saying? One of the things you learn quickly is you can't think out loud, right? Because you'll have some harebrained thought and you'll be just chatting and say, I think we ought to do such and such. And 2 weeks later, somebody's done it. And you say, I was kidding, right? That was a really bad idea. I was just saying it. But there's this thing called tone at the top, which everybody talks about. Right? And it turns out it is true. It is exactly true. People look to the top of the company and take their guidance from it. You got to be careful, and you got to realize it. There are all kinds of phrases, shadow of a leader, all those kinds of things. But they're kind of sobering, but they're true. And the last thing I wrote down, and it'll be the next last thing I say, you remember you're human. I went down to our corporate retreat 10 years ago, not long after I got the job. Went down with the operating people, and these are all old friends, right? I went down for dinner and a cocktail hour, and I spoke to them. I had a great time. Saw everybody. It was just a ton of fun. I came back. I was telling my wife what a great time I had. And she said, of course you had a great time. They all treat you like you're a rock star. And that's true. It's kind of sobered me up. The Caesars, the Roman Caesars, supposedly, when they came back from a great military victory, they had a parade called a triumph. And in the chariot with them was a slave whose whole purpose was to stand there and whisper in there the whole time, you are human, you are human, you are human. And I was one of 30,000 people at NS. I had a job, but I was just one of 30,000. So let me talk about 2 minutes more. I was thinking about this talk coming down here today, and realized the one thing that I really have not said quite enough about is corporate culture and how important it is. And this is something that you learn as well, because in some very real way, the CEO is responsible if no one else is for the corporate culture. And there's a saying which I think is attributed to Peter Drucker, which is that culture trumps strategy every time. And what he's really saying is that if you have a corporate strategy and it's not in alignment with the culture of your company, it will never work, right? Companies defeat ideas that aren't in alignment with their culture. And we did a lot of work on it in my time. We started by defining the values of our company, or what we thought the values should be, which we had never really done. And we came up with something, I'm looking at all these people who know them, called the spirit values, right? Safety, performance, integrity, respect, innovation, and teamwork. And we promoted them relentlessly throughout the company. And then we did the next important thing is we started to reward people and promote people based on those values. And that was a big change because in a lot of our culture, we rewarded people who carried out the mission, but if they left a lot of body bags, we didn't care. And that changed, and that was an important signal. And then we started about 5 years ago as the next step in our safety program, and this was really led by our chief operating officer, to start using behavioral science, if you will, to change the culture of the company, to open it up, to use positive rather than negative reinforcement, something that we were really not good at, and to kind of do briefings and debriefings about all of this. And we've spent a lot of time, we've spent a lot of money. It's a long journey, but I think the company is better for it and will be better and better for it in the future. So that's it. Kid who loved trains for reasons that I don't know that I can define. There have been a lot of great managers, a lot of great people in the railroad business. It's been my great good fortune to be one of them and to be part of that. And I appreciate you listening to me talk about my two favorite subjects other than the grandkids. So thanks. And we'll do questions.
Hello, I'm Simon Barabee, a PhD student in transportation. So first, thank you for coming and speaking with us and giving some of your wisdom and sharing it with us. You said that you were prepared to do your share as an industry, and last year, Clayton County residents were asked whether they wanted to extend high-capacity transit to Clayton County. 76% of them said yes. The only way they will get heavy rail is through a shared agreement with Norfolk Southern. So my first question is, are you guys even using these tracks to capacity? And as you did in Virginia with the Virginia Railway Express, what would it take for you to have a shared track agreement with MARTA?
Well, let's see. MARTA's electrified, which presents its own set of issues that would be difficult for us to deal with. But let me give you my general answer to that. And VRE, which we run down to Manassas, is a good example of that. If someone wants to talk to us about running heavy rail, light rail and heavy rail, the government won't let you mix. Commuters on our railroad, we say we are always willing to have that dialogue, but here are the three things that have to be addressed to our satisfaction. The first is capacity. Roger knows all this. The first is capacity, and there are ways to do that. You can model, right, the railroad. You can model additional trains. You can model interference from commuter operations, freight operations, and it's our right of way. We're a freight carrier, and you've got and so if someone comes and wants to run trains, we have to be comfortable that there's enough capacity so that we won't interfere with the commuter operation, whoever it is, and they won't interfere with us. And if there's not enough capacity and you have to build more, the folks who want to run the commuters bring some money, right? Bring the money for the new infrastructure. The second thing that has to be taken care of is the liability, and this is huge for us. And what the railroad really wants, and we have something that approaches it with BRE, is what's called but-for liability. But for the fact that you were here, we wouldn't have had any problem. Therefore, regardless of what happens, the commuter agency, if there's an accident, indemnifies the railroad. That's something, by the way, Amtrak has. If there's an Amtrak accident and Norfolk Southern had some problem that was part of that, Amtrak still pays. That's part of the Amtrak legislation. The third thing that has to be addressed is there has to be some kind of compensation to us for the use of our right-of-way, right? We're a privately owned company by our shareholders. That's probably the least of the significant things. So then you get into, if you get into something like MARTA, with, you've got to electrify the railroad or things like that, you then enter into real complexities in terms of the safety of our operation, right? And platform height or whatever it is. But that's our general reaction to anyone who wants to use the railroad for heavy rail. We are certainly willing to talk, but you've got to get through. These are the things that have to be addressed. Is that fair?
Can I ask a final question?
Yeah.
That's perfectly fair, but the S line that I'm referring to, and I guess pretty much any other rail line, this one goes through Forest Park in Jonesboro, was built with some public money. So do you think that there is some responsibility for the railway company to address it?
Could you not hear? I'll answer it.
No, I did a study on the commuter rail from Atlanta to Macon of the old Central Georgia main line. That was never built.
Yeah, but let me say this. There are examples of railroad infrastructure out there where there were easements from the state or whatever it was. But by and large, and the Western railroads have a lot of that stuff. There have been any number of exhaustive studies that essentially said that in the last 150 years, through the transportation, things like the transportation of troops and materials in wartime, that the debt has long since been repaid. Now, the S line through Forest Park, we had extensive, not about MARTA, we had extensive commuter rail conversations there 10 years, I mean, back even when I was in strategic planning, and the problem was the state governments couldn't agree on pulling the trigger to spend the money. So, but by and large, we're always willing to talk, but do we feel we always feel the obligation to be a good citizen. Do we think that we have any financial encumbrance? No.
I'll just speak loudly. How has the environmental impact from the railroad changed over the years? What's enabled that change?
Well, I think that we have done a lot. In fact, we are very environmentally focused in a number of ways. Obviously, reducing fuel emissions through burning fuel, which just makes good business sense anyway. So we do a whole lot more to make sure we don't leave engines idling and put technology on to prevent that. Things in terms of kind of optimizing, route structure, again, so that we're as efficient and therefore as fuel intensive, less fuel intensive. We do a lot of advertising in terms of our environmental impact versus other modes of transportation. We haul a ton of freight. The industry average now is a ton of freight moves on a gallon of fuel 479 miles. So we have a huge green advantage from that regard. At Norfolk Southern, we've done a couple of interesting things. We did a project about 6 years ago, 7 maybe now, where we went around essentially to all the buildings and shops and facilities on the railroad and replaced them with more energy efficient lighting, right? Which saved us, again, good business. Had 3-year payback to get all of that old lighting out. We've got a huge project underway up at Altoona, our locomotive shops up there, to completely do all of the heating, to get rid of old coal-fired boilers because it runs on steam heat now, and run gas generation and things like that. And then the other things that we've done kind of on the softer side is we've really been focused on a couple of important things. One is reforestation. We've sponsored the planting of 6 million trees down in the Mississippi Delta. We've got a huge corporate facility outside of Charleston, about 12,000 acres. We put a conservation easement on it. So we're constantly looking for those kinds of things. We've done a lot internally in terms of chapters of folks who want to get out and collect trash, recycle cardboard, do all of those kinds of things.
Georgia Regional Transportation Authority owned that line between Atlanta and Macon. And the Norfolk Southern agreed to do the dispatching of the trains. They agreed to lay welded rail. They It was 100-pound jointed rail, been there since 1942. All this kind of stuff. The thing that bogged it down was the county and the state would not fund it after the government funds it for 30 years. And they were going to put in signals between Forest Park and Macon, and it was going to run 70 miles an hour. Except it was 106 miles as opposed to 92 miles on I-75. But anyway, it wasn't the railroad that bogged it down. It was the fact they were not willing to pay for what it took to cost to run that thing between the county and the state after the government funds had run out.
Yeah.
But it was absolutely the best commuter rail thing that I've ever seen. And the Norfolk Southern was running 3 trains a day, and they were all locals. They could have been running Hyatt. We were going to run 2 trains a day to Macon and 4 to Griffin. And unfortunately, the fare was going to be $22 one way. That was going to be kind of tough. Excuse me, $11 one way, sorry. Excuse me.
We worked on that. I thought that was actually, the problem you have now is we started running more trains down the S line. Oops.
That was before we started running that container train.
Yeah, we ran Triple Crown down. So the S line, interestingly enough, supposedly, here's the historical fact about the S line. It's the old Central of Georgia to Macon. Supposedly, it runs along the Eastern Continental Divide, and there are no water-carrying structures underneath it. Everything on the east side of the track goes one way, and everything on the west drains the other. And right, Peachtree Street is, did I get that right? Isn't Peachtree Street on the Eastern Continental Divide? Yeah, okay. All right, trivia. Yes, sir, Michael. Okay, you got to wait. All right.
I mean, I can answer trivia.
All right, sir, I have a question about leadership, so I hope you're tied to your shoes because this might be a tough question.
Okay.
You said you were talking about your 3 lessons from Harvard, and one of them was the limitations and frailty of big management. So kind of a personal question, what was your big frailty? What was your weakness, and how did you deal with that as a high-level leadership?
That's a very good question. The answer I will give you, I'll answer the second part not very well. You know, it sounds, what I was going to say, it sounds too much like my biggest fault is I work too hard. I tend to like people, right? And I tend to I always try to see the best in people. And sometimes that gets in the way of doing something that I needed to do more quickly than I eventually did. You know, I mean, that's kind of part of it. It's part of who I am, right? But let me say this, self-awareness is not a bad thing. I've always known that about myself. But even though, just because you're aware of it doesn't necessarily mean that you're really good at dealing with it. All right, well, ask your mom. Ask LaWanna, she's known me forever. What were my biggest weaknesses? I'm retired, and listen, this woman has never spared her opinion of me before.
You pretty much nailed it. There were times when I think it would have been much easier had you just made the decision and gone with it. But you tend to like to please
Yeah.
as much as possible.
Yeah.
Try to find the middle ground instead of just saying, this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah. I got a little better at that later, but never great. Yeah, that's it.
Thing that's in the news recently, you want to comment on the CP business?
In one of the most ill-conceived, stupid ideas formulated by man, has made an offer to buy and merge with Norfolk Southern. I think I just expressed how I feel about it. It's just dumb on so many levels, and driven, unfortunately, by ego, and the ego of 2 people. It seems to be coopered up. right now. Although I don't know if you saw it, that one of the egos is a guy who runs Canadian Pacific, a guy named Hunter Harrison, who I've known for a long time and actually like. But Hunter just did an interview and said, well, we've talked to CSX again. How stupid is that? I mean, really, it's just kind of crazy. It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate your patience. I droned on for quite a while. Hopefully you didn't nod off too quickly, so thanks. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. Wonderful. We would like to present a small token of our appreciation to you all. And Kelsey, from our leadership program,
Kelsey.
do the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
Nice
you
to
so
meet
much
you.
for coming and speaking to us
Well,
today.
this is probably the nicest thing that's ever happened to me. So thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. You didn't have to do that. Thank you. All right. I've got a little Ramblin' Wreck on the shelf, so I'm in good shape. Thanks.